yesterday, where we got educated a little and entertained a whole lot, from classical art to dealing with our teeming millions, from Shakespeare to learning from a sportsperson's preparation before a match. Heck, some of us even got a little drunk, I think, while we were learning to mix a few mean cocktails. We're privileged to be beginning today with someone who has walked the talk many a times on how it's possible or even imperative to be environmentally sound while being on the path of progress. Preserving nature is not just one of the many things that we have to do. It's got to be interwoven with our daily lives. And what happens in real life, however, is something that this short video depicts. So let's just take a look. Going green, the why and how. And we have with us Economist, former Union Minister and now Member of Parliament, Jairam Ramesh, sharing his thoughts and ideas at the intersection of democracy, capitalism, development and ecology. Incidentally, his book, Green Signals, was also the story of environmental policy making from the perspective of a pivotal decision maker. And we have Madhavan Narayan, who will introduce Jairam to us. Madhavan?
He doesn't fit into the image of a politician. He has been an economist, a journalist, and in some ways represents the spirit of Knowledge Factory. He's worked for the World Bank, he's worked for the Times of India, he's worked for technology missions, and yet he has also been a hands-on expert on politics. And his book on the intersection of ecology, democracy, and capitalism brings a corpus of experiences and perspectives into a single work, which is very good for the country, of course, but for us it is extra special because I've also known Jairam Ramesh as a music lover who also likes to crack a good joke more often than not. And in that sense, he represents the personality that we like to shape from the people who attend Knowledge Factory. You know, well-rounded, intelligent citizens who look beyond technocratic education like finance or software. So in that sense, he's the kind of a person that many people who attend Knowledge Factory should aspire to be according to us. So without further ado, I expect Jairam to speak on going green, the why and the how, because there are some very difficult choices that India faces as it tries to be a fast-growing economy, on the one hand comparing itself with China, and on the other hand drooling at its lips over trying to have, let's say, Scandinavian-style environmentalism. So all choices are difficult, and particularly those that involve not between right and wrong, but between the right and the good, as I say. So over to Jairam. He was just cribbing to us about how he doesn't fancy a culture of 140 characters of Twitter, but happy to tell you that Knowledge Factory at KF 2017 was trending all day yesterday on Twitter, which at least takes to the millennials and the tens of millions people, or my own 150,000 followers, some of the ideas or at least the appetizers so that they can later read the book or engage in themes that he'll be speaking about.
I'm actually a Stepney this morning because I think Arun Shourie was supposed to be here talking about the Constitution, and for some reason he couldn't be here, and Madhavan called me and said, can I step in? So I said, sure, I'll come in because...
And a very big special thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you. I would have loved to speak to you about the Constitution, but I think you have another session.
Yes, we were so grateful that you were coming that we let the choice to you. And and I have known Jairam Ramesh for 30 years almost now, and I can tell you that whatever topic he speaks on will bring perspective. And this is not special praise; it's an objective observation.
The Constitution is very few people actually discuss how the Constitution was made, and I think that's a very fascinating story. How personalities shaped the Constitution, how there was a debate about values, vision of India, the debates that took place, the differences that were there, and I think I would recommend to each of you.
Jairam, I have an instant offer for you. The next session with Swara Bhaskar is exactly on this, and you would make a better fireside chatter than
I just, I'm delighted that you're actually having this session on the Constitution. I would have loved to speak on that, but since you already have...
The offer stands with a gratefulness.
No, let's focus on what the nice little video clip that we saw, which is going green, why and how.
I'll take yours.
And let me speak for a few minutes and then have more time for questions and answers, because I think that's more interesting. Why should we go green? That's the fundamental question. After all, India, developing country, needs high economic growth. 10 million Indians join the labor force every year. We got to create 10 million jobs a year. So why worry about the environment? I mean, after all, environment is something that the middle class and the Western countries can talk about. But why should we, as a developing country, as a country with a huge backlog of infrastructure to be built, jobs to be generated, investments to be continued, why should we worry about the environment? I mean, this is, I think, a fundamental question. And unless we come to grips with this question, we are not going to be able to answer the next question, which is the how. So why environment? Why green? And let me suggest to you that there are 4 compelling reasons why India must take environment seriously, and why India must not follow the American model or the Chinese model or the Brazilian model, which has been grow now, pay later. You have 20 years of uninterrupted growth, and you worry about the consequences of that growth 20 years from now. So the grow now, pay later model, which is the only model that modern economics teaches, why India should not follow this trajectory. The first and most important reason is the demographic reason. I think we should never forget that ultimately underpinning any society is the demographics of that society. And what is our demographics? Today we are 1.25 billion, and whatever we do, even if all Indians were to take in a fit of amnesia a vow of brahmacharya, we will be 1.7 billion by the year 2040 because of the demographic bulge that exists today. So we're going to be adding 400 million people in the next 30 years. And this is at a time when most countries are going to see either declining populations, like in the Western countries, or stable population, like China. In fact, China's population also begins to decline by 2040, 2045. India is the only country, the only big country, whose population is going to continue to increase, as I said, 400 million over the next 30 years. That's a staggering number. We're going to be adding 1/3 of our population in the next 30 years. Now, not only are we adding population in terms of quantity, but the median age of our population is going to continue to be in the low 30s. Today, the median age of Indian population is 28, and even as our population expands astronomically, our median age is unlikely to cross the late 30s. So we have a burgeoning population, we have a young population to contend with over the next 3 to 4 decades. And therefore, the consumption of natural resources today is a very important question from an intergenerational point of view. Most countries don't have to worry about future generations because future generations are not going to be there, to put it very starkly. But in India, this is a big issue in India, intergenerational equity, simply because the future generations are going to be very, very large in terms of quantity and also young, making demands on consumption and investment. So the first reason is the demographic reason, which makes India an outlier. The second important reason why we must go green is because we are perhaps the only country in the world which has the maximum vulnerability to climate change. Now, Mr. Trump and his advisors may deny climate change, but climate change is a reality. And climate change affects different people in different ways, but we are perhaps the only country which is affected by climate change in every way. The monsoon, on which we depend, the uncertainty and the unpredictability of the monsoon on account of climate change is one source of vulnerability for us. The increase in mean sea levels along the 7,000 kilometer line coast that we have, in which about 200 million people live, the increase in mean sea levels is a threat to the coastal areas, and this is something that is very much a reality in 9 or 10 states of our country. The retreat of the Himalayan glaciers, which is now beyond doubt, has enormous implications for water security, for snow melt into the rivers of the Indo-Gangetic Plain, and the fact that most of our natural resources, which we need for economic growth, like coal, iron ore, bauxite, uranium, are all located in rich forest areas. So the more resources you extract, the more areas you deforest and add to global warming. So the vulnerability factor on account of monsoon, glaciers, coastal areas and deforestation, this cocktail does not exist in any other country of the world. And I think this is what makes India somewhat unique. So this is the second reason. The first is demographic, the second is climate change. The third reason, which I think is now becoming very, very significant, very apparent, is the public health consequences of environmental actions. We are all now becoming victims of environmental disasters. You talk of air pollution, you talk of water pollution, you talk of chemical contamination, and you immediately now begin to get concerned about the public health consequences, the impact of morbidity, the impact on illness, the impact, maybe it's not, the impact on mortality is not very apparent, but the impact on morbidity, for example, the incidence of asthma, the incidence of cardiovascular diseases is now well established in many urban areas on account of water pollution, and we know that large areas of the Indo-Gangetic belt are vulnerable to carcinogenic threats because of arsenic poisoning, the presence of arsenic in groundwater. So whether it's air pollution, whether it's water pollution, whether it's chemical contamination, public health is becoming a big issue. And unlike many economies of the world, India is like the United States in one regard, which is that the bulk of our spending on public health comes from private sources. 70% of health expenditure in India comes from private sources. You and I pay more for health than we get access through a system like the UK's National Health Service. So public health is really a misnomer in India. It's really private health. And the more we get exposed to pollution, the more we get exposed to contamination, private expenditures on health is going up, adding to rural indebtedness most visibly. So this is the third reason. And the fourth and final reason why India must think differently is that unlike in the Western countries, where environment is really an issue of lifestyles, should you have your second car, should you live in the suburban areas, should you have your third air conditioner. In India, environment is still fundamentally an issue of livelihoods, not one of lifestyle. It's access to water, access to land, access to forests. These are day-to-day livelihood issues which people grapple with. And this has got nothing to do with lifestyles. It's got everything to do with livelihoods. So, 4 reasons for the first question. Why? Demographic, climate change, public health, and livelihoods. Now, let's go to the how. Now, if we recognize that India must go green, that India must incorporate within its economic strategy green considerations, how do we go about it? That's the big issue. And I think here, what I have to say is conditioned a lot by the experiences I had when I was Minister for Environment. And one thing I recognized is that you cannot deny the need for economic growth. You need economic expansion, you need investment, you need faster industrialization, and whether you like it or not, urbanization will happen. People will move from villages to towns, people will move from towns to cities, and people will move from cities to metropolitan areas. That's something that is inevitable. So it's inevitable, it's also desirable in some ways. So we must recognize that there is this overarching need for 7.5 or 8% rate of economic growth, simply because you need to create the number of jobs for the people who are entering the labor force. So the question is, how do you go about crafting an economic strategy, an economic policy that is not just growth stimulating, but also something that protects the ecological security, adds to the ecological security of communities, adds to the ecological security of the country as well. And I'm afraid there is no other route than to recognize that environment is an externality, it requires intelligent regulation, it requires intelligent laws, it requires standards, and most importantly, it requires the enforcement of laws, standards, and regulations. And I think once we recognize this, once we accept the reality that environment is not a cost to be borne, environment is not a burden to be borne, but environment is something that you need to look after as part of normal economic activity, normal corporate strategy, then I think we will begin to find the answers. But the answers have to be found not in a laissez-faire framework, but the answers have to be found in a framework that sets down laws for the protection of water, air, forests, and so on and so forth, which enforces those laws, which creates incentives for economic agents to follow these laws and regulations and standards that the government has set up. I think this is the crux of the dilemma that we face in policy making. That how do you decide these issues? And the fact remains that there are trade-offs. And sometimes decisions that get taken will get in favor of the forces of economic expansion, but sometimes decisions that get taken would favor the preservation of the environment and say no to that particular investment or economic expansion. If you're going to open up large areas of forests for coal mining, for example, that would be a recipe for ecological disaster. On the other hand, you need more power plants, you need more industry, but you need to do that in a manner that respects laws, standards, and regulations. So I can give you numerous examples of where these trade-offs are visible. Should you build, for example, one of the big issues that I had to deal with was whether we build dams on the upper reaches of the Ganga in Uttarakhand, where it would have meant impounding large amounts of water, and it would have meant rivers being bereft of water. And the faith of, after all, the Ganga is also a matter of faith as far as Indians are concerned. So that was an example of a trade-off. Should you allow, what should you do if there is a demand for mining of bauxite? Bauxite is very important, aluminum is very important, but should you allow bauxite mining in a hill that is considered to be sacred by the local tribal community? How do you decide on such issues? What should be India's policy for genetically modified food crops? Should you allow them? Should you prohibit them? Should you follow a precautionary principle as far as genetically modified food crops are concerned? So these are some of the issues. So let me not speak any longer and throw it open. I think the important thing to recognize is that we have a challenge of trying to marry ecological objectives with economic objectives. And we must recognize that there is a trade-off. We must recognize that there is a conflict at times. We must also recognize that these trade-offs and these conflicts can only be managed in an open, transparent, accountable, democratic framework. These are not decisions that can be taken unilaterally, one way or the other, but these are things that need to be debated, and once they are debated, a decision is taken, everybody falls in line. I think that's the crux of the issue, and these decisions, to guide these decisions, we need laws, we need standards, we need regulations, we need institutions, and we need the enforcement. We need to bring about a culture of enforcement in our system. The hopeful thing that I see is that in the last couple of years, last 5 years particularly, because of the enormous concern on air pollution, environment is now becoming a topic of charcha. So everybody is talking about environment, everybody is talking about pollution, because they are seeing the public health impact, and particularly in Delhi. I mean, nothing happens in India if Delhi is not affected. So first thing, Delhi got affected, and this will become now, everybody is talking about it, but actually the rest of India has been suffering for the last 30, 40 years. Nobody is bothered, but since Delhi, everybody is beginning to cough right now, everybody wearing a mask when they go for a walk. Pollution has emerged now as a big issue. How do you tackle this issue is now a major public policy concern. One of the paradoxes, and I want to leave you with this thought, One of the great paradoxes about Indian society is that there is perhaps no other culture in the world which venerates nature as Indian culture does. We worship our rivers, but we make them into sewers. We worship our mountains, but we deforest the mountains. We worship our forests, but we deforest the rich forest areas. We have gods and goddesses associated with animals. We have Durga on a tiger, we have Durga on a lion, we have Ganesha with an elephant trunk, on a mouse, you name it, gods and goddesses. So respect for nature is not alien to Indian society. Respect for nature is something that ought to come naturally to us, because we respect biodiversity. Because unlike Western civilization, which is based on a triumph over nature, Indian civilization has always talked about living in harmony with nature, not destroying nature. However, the paradox is that we as legatees of this civilization have tended to treat nature in a very cavalier fashion. We have tended to treat nature as something that will take care of itself. It does not take care of itself. You disturb the ecological balance, nature has a way of getting back at you. We destroyed the mangroves all along our coastal areas, and tsunami destroyed us. And the only areas of Tamil Nadu, Pondicherry, and parts of Andhra, which were saved from tsunami, are the areas where the mangroves had still been there. We build roads in an ecologically haphazard manner in mountain areas. One torrential downpour, you have floods and people get completely devastated. We saw this a few years ago in Uttarakhand. So nature has a way of getting back if you disturb the ecological balance. And I think the big concern that I had, and I continue to have, is that we worship the god of GDP much more than we worship the god of nature now. I think both these gods or goddesses, as it may be, are worthy of worship. And the real question is, how do you marry the two, and what are the choices that you make? How do you make these choices, fully recognizing that at times economic growth might get priority, but there will be occasions when environmental protection of particularly vulnerable areas will have greater priority than economic growth. So let me stop here and have more time for questions.
I think we do have time for
we
questions.
We have some time for...
In fact, we are expecting good questions from the audience, and that was a wonderful speech. We have raised hands already from very young people, which is what is...
Did you tweet?
I've tweeted a lot. You'll go them. I was just going to recommend to my Twitter followers that people should read Amitav Ghosh's Hungry Tide as fiction, and then his book as fact, to really connect the dots. The other
Actually, you should read Amitav Ghosh, because my book is, you want to sleep, read my book, but if you want to really get excited about climate change and environment, Amitav Ghosh has put it in much more, poetic language.
I think people need both. That's the whole idea. People get inspired by one and educated by the other. Yeah. But I mentioned also, incidentally, he mentioned the urban problems of pollution and all. We have another session today on the urban crisis with Bharti Chaturvedi of Chintan.
Yeah, Bharti is doing good work.
Yeah, so she'll be speaking in the afternoon. That's why it fits in with everything, this is God's orders that you replace the constitution with a green concern, But any welcome questions here. Let's begin with...
One of the things, since you're talking about the constitution in the next section, the constitution was silent on green in 1950. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting. Our founding fathers were not terribly, barring Gandhi, who is the patron saint of modern environmentalism. Nehru, Patel, Ambedkar, Prasad, Azad, were not great green types. Gandhi was a great green type, no doubt. But Gandhi was not involved in the constitution making. So the Indian constitution that was given to us in 1950 was silent on green. It's only in 1976, in that infamous period of our Indian political history called the emergency, that green became a presence in our constitution. Indira Gandhi was a great green politician. So she used her majority in parliament to amend the constitution, to bring in the notion of fundamental duties, which, and one of our duties which we don't fulfill unfortunately is to protect the environment. But also she changed the architecture of regulation of forests. Forests used to be left to the state governments to manage. Forests came onto the concurrent list, and after 1976, in fact, the rate of deforestation has fallen considerably because of the tighter controls on the diversion of forest
Interesting,
areas.
one hidden gain of the emergency that we never really knew about.
No, I am not justifying the emergency, by the way. I am just saying that there was an amendment, a very important amendment, 42nd Amendment of the Constitution in 1976. And it's very interesting. The 42nd Amendment, when Morarji Desai became Prime Minister in March of 1977, there was a 44th Amendment to the Constitution which repealed the 42nd Amendment. The Congress Party of Indira Gandhi voted for repealing the very amendment that they had bought during the emergency. However, what survived in the 44th Amendment was the green part of the 42nd Amendment.
Fantastic.
That's very interesting.
That is
when the 44th Amendment repealed the 42nd Amendment about fundamental rights, courts, everything, they removed everything. But the thing on environment, the thing on forests, the thing on wildlife, they maintained.
Poetic justice.
That's a very interesting story. That's the
Yeah,
interesting
in fact, I'm tempted to say that we were going to discuss either the constitution or ecology. He has made it both. So like Ashwin Ravichandar, you don't know when it's bad and when it's ball. Yeah, questions.
Good morning, sir. I have two questions related to what you just said, which are, interlinked to each other at the root. So,
You speak a little louder.
I have two questions which are linked at the bottom at the root related to what you just said. If you ask a restless kid to, stay calm without fixing the reason for his restlessness, the instructions in the Gyan may not work, while the intent is definitely genuine and needed. What do I mean to say? So, one thing that you said that we worship the nature, but still, pollute the same. I've seen in small towns, people worship, cows, and they are pretty, they get violent if something bad happens to that animal. So can we bring that spirit, one is compliance in sleep. You sleepwalk in the compliance that we need to worship, but we are not conscious about that. About cows, we are conscious. Same way about trees, about water. That feeling of, respect can be brought in the people. So something can be done. So people are conscious that they are doing something wrong if they are being negligent about this. This is one. So second is, we talk about that there are trade-offs between development needs and environmental needs. But on the other hand, I would say that, there are other things which are, driving it. For example, a lot of people come over here in Delhi for work, whether they are Mazdoors or, CEOs. Why? Because offices are over here. So why don't we have, let's say, office of Bharti Airtel in Bareilly and for UP West instead of having it in Noida? Okay. So people have to drive on over here.
Okay, I get a question. Sorry, we're short of time, but the essence of it is that he's asking two questions. There are earthy rural areas, people concerned over environment. Even Jallikattu has an environment angle in Tamil Nadu when people protested in favor of old sport. He says, why don't we have that kind of concern in urban areas? Have I got your question right? The other question interesting is that why is corporatization taking place only in urban areas? Doesn't it make more sense for environment to disperse some of these corporate offices? Is that good public policy? Have I got your question? Okay. No, we get it. We're getting too complex there. We have to be a bit space. So is there a case for public policy or approaches where we can actually have the law and order of an urban area with the dispersion, dispersal of offices in such a way that we don't create overcrowding and congestion and some of the other environmental problems that come with that?
Well, the first question that you raised, that is, if I understand you right, is that consciousness on environmental issues is more in rural areas than there are in urban areas. Am I right?
Yeah, small towns you mentioned.
And why is it that in urban areas we are not able to create the same degree of respect for nature? I think the answer to me is pretty obvious, because I think in urban areas the pressure is much more on economic activity. The pressure is much more on investment, on jobs, and environment is seen to be something that's a luxury. It's something that you can worry about once you have dealt with expansion. I mean, Gurgaon is a classic example. If you had environment from day one, Gurgaon wouldn't have developed the way it did. However, it could also be argued that Gurgaon may not have developed at all. It depends. It can work both ways. So I think in urban areas, I think the premium that is placed on economic expansion is much more than the premium that you face in terms of livelihoods in rural areas. Remember what I told you, in large parts of India, people are worried about environmental issues because they are livelihood issues. But in Delhi, Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, in urban areas, they are not livelihood issues. Environmental issues are not livelihood issues for you and me. They may be health issues for you and me, but they are not livelihood issues. And one of the reasons why you see this great concern for the environment amongst large sections of our people is because they are dependent on forests, they are dependent on water, they are dependent on rivers, they are dependent on mountains for their daily livelihoods. And when that livelihood is threatened, they respond in a particular fashion, which you don't find in the urban areas.
Good point.
And I think the other point is, why not disperse? Is that
sort of a decongest or have more balanced development, so there is not too much of urbanization of centralized in areas.
Well,
like Delhi.
I think urbanization is inevitable. People are going to move. People will move from villages to towns, towns to cities, and cities thereafter. Question is, how do you manage the consequences of urbanization? We have not been very successful so far, I have to admit, because the mindset in India has been that urbanization is a threat, that something that we should not embrace, we should not welcome. But we have now come to realize painfully that urbanization is inevitable. You can't do anything unless you follow the Chinese system of introducing a permit for anybody who wants to migrate into a city, which is not possible in the Indian context.
I thought the Aadhaar card was doing that.
Good point. Maybe Aadhaar will be used for controlling migration at some stage.
Young.
So morning, sir.
Yeah.
So
After this.
I study in class 10. So in geography, we keep on learning about how there's a need for economic development. And at the end of the chapter, we always find this paragraph about sustainable development. So, it's easy to just put a paragraph and just say we need regulation and all that. But when it comes to walking the walk, what should be the recipe that balances both equally?
What should individuals do?
I think, you're talking about individuals or government. I think if you recall, I summed it up in a tweet. He says you need laws, standards, regulation, and enforcement. Four things he mentioned.
What governments do is basically set the framework. The framework is laws, regulations, standards, most important institutions, and most importantly the enforcement of those things. So that's what governments do. But the behavior is that of individual economic agents, companies, individuals. What should companies do? In my view, it's a simple no-brainer. Companies should just follow the laws of the land. Unfortunately, a problem arises when companies adopt shortcuts.
Let me also ask, what should tribunals do when dealing with government?
The National Green Tribunal was an example of an institution that got created to deal with the types of issues. But I think your question is one step more, is what can individuals do?
Yeah, I
What
think
can-
about individuals or, yeah.
What can individual? Well, individuals can certainly. The only thing I can think of is that, if you look at our carbon footprint, if you look at the average Indian's carbon footprint is much lower than that of in Europe or in China or in America. But if you take the top 10% income bracket of Indians, their carbon footprint is the same as that you have in Europe, America and China. So how do you change those carbon footprints? And that's where lifestyles become important. That's not livelihood issue, that's a lifestyle issue. It's the type of buildings you design, it's the type of transportation systems that you design, it's the type of appliance systems that you use in your house, and these are individual choices. What governments can do is only so much, but ultimately you and I have to make those choices that we are going to have a carbon footprint that is sustainable, which means, to put it very bluntly, walk when you can and take a bus or a metro when you must. So that is one choice in transport. In terms of regulating house heating, house cooling, taking systems that are actually less of a pressure on the carbon than what we see today. So, it goes into individual choices, how you lead your individual life. And that's where I think the best thing I can tell you is do what Gandhi did.
Yeah.
Gandhi is a good example of, Gandhi is not a great example for a country to follow. He is a great example for an individual to follow.
Brilliant quote. Yeah.
Difficult for a country to follow Gandhi. But it's very easy for individuals to follow Gandhi. And I think Gandhi was a brilliant man because he thought that if all individuals followed me, the country may follow
Yeah,
me.
after all, be the change you
Well,
want
the
to
country,
see.
yeah, be the change that you want to be.
See,
yeah.
yeah. Here? Sorry, we've not too much time.
Sir, just one last question on.
Yeah,
I'm here.
carry on. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, we hear all these best practices, and just taking a cue from what he said. Do you think there has to be an incentivization for citizens, to do or to probably contribute a little more, because there is incentivization for coming to cities, getting modern, earning more, but somehow there is no incentivization for going green. I know it's pretty callous. I mean, it's responsibility, but when it's not really working, then what do you say?
Yeah, in other words, how do we incentivize green behavior, whether it's a corporate or an individual? Is there a case to do that? A lot of, even that boy mentioned the same thing, that there's too much of environmentalism based on moral appeal. Can we take it from morality to a more realistic framework of a game theory or something, where people will be green? Because, like for instance, recently we've had this very interesting example of a kiosk where you put in used plastic bottles and you get a discount coupon. So,
Well, there are already, for companies, there are already incentives for going green. For companies, okay? May not be for individuals, but certainly for companies, for investing in green technologies, there are a whole slew of incentives that they have. The trouble in our country is that the disincentives are not powerful enough to deter behavior that is antithetical to what the laws want. An art of living can get by giving a few lakhs as a fine. So our laws, the penalties in our laws are laughable, really laughable. 1 lakh, 2 lakhs, in terms of fines. So there must be strong deterrent provisions for non-green behavior, as much as there should be incentives for green behavior.
Yeah.
But today you are seeing in the market, there are green air conditioners. The star rating, you get stars, those are green air conditioners. You have green coolers, a whole slew of appliances that are green, and those incentives are given by the government through the budget for making those products cheaper. So there are in our system fair amount of incentives. My problem is that we do not disincentivize non-green behavior.
Yeah, let me throw in a
That's
question
the
that
real issue.
we have had recently instances of Volkswagen and BP.
Look at Volkswagen. They doctored their emissions data, and they have had to pay, I think yesterday I read,
Cough up.
$14 billion. I mean, really want to bankrupt Volkswagen for a couple of years. I mean, that's the type of deterrent. That's why I applauded the National Green Tribunal when they put this
You think you can
5 crore fine on the art of living for the floodplains, the Yamuna floodplains.
Fine on Sri Sri.
But, I don't know what it was. Yeah, but there was a lot of criticism on that fine also. So I think the disincentive has to be steep. And you have to make a couple of examples, exemplars, of what will happen if you don't follow the laws, what will happen if you don't follow those standards. One of the things, here's a line for you to tweet, one of the things, in India, we take great delight in passing laws and greater delight in bypassing them.
Quote of the festival.
That's a Twitter line.
Yeah, brilliant. Very quintessentially,
See how
Jairam, he
Twitter-
makes up for his quotes are very tweetable. I've known them for at least 25 years. If he comes then on Twitter, I'm sure he'll put the the professional stand-ups out of business.
But it's true. It's true. You look, I find it very I've seen very few companies who are really following the laws of the land. And no government company or private company makes no difference. In fact, government is one of the worst polluters. Government companies are amongst the worst polluters. The DTC buses, most of you may not remember that 10 years ago, these DTC buses were the dirtiest buses in the world till the Supreme Court mandated that they must convert to CNG. And now we have 7,000 buses running on CNG. Government is as non-green as the private behavior. That makes no difference.
Which is why the Supreme Court has to step in most of the cases, But do you think that's a good thing that Supreme Court is helping us?
Well, the judicial activism comes in when there is executive inertia.
That's another quote.
So if the executive is not, my view has always been that if the executive is monkeying around, the judiciary will intervene. If politicians are going to take over the board of cricket and run it as their private fiefdoms, the Supreme Court is going to intervene. I think the fact that all these guys who never held a bat or a ball in their lives were controlling the cricket board was an invitation for somebody to come and intervene, and the Supreme Court intervened. So if the executive is smart, if the executive follows a transparent protocol, it's unlikely that the courts are going to intervene.
Interestingly, I've been reading back to the Constitution that the Constitution is, under the Indian Constitution is even supreme to the Parliament. So it is only logical that the court, judiciary as a custodian of the Constitution steps in, even when there is parliamentary inertia.
Well, what the Supreme Court has said is that there is a basic structure of the Constitution which cannot be tampered with. But my view is although I am in politics, I am not one of those who looks upon judicial activism with suspicion. Because in most cases, judicial activism has actually been for the good. And the Delhi CNG bus example is the best example I can think of, where the Supreme Court said you will have CNG in the buses, and CNG in the buses was reality.
Yeah. Any other question? Yeah, I have many hands going up. Yeah, here, please. We'll come
You
back.
also had a hand from here to stop.
No. She said people are loving your.
He was to say we could go on.
You may not be on Twitter, but there are already fan messages going out on Twitter. So yeah, this gentleman here.
Yeah.
Hi, so my name is Karthik Berry, I'm from HCL. I have a couple of questions, or one question in several parts. I was wondering what you think about nuclear as a zero carbon energy source, given that it's consistently over its life cycle been proven to be zero carbon to the extent solar and wind are. what you think about India's natural thorium reserves and where we are in the development of our thorium nuclear reactors and the risks posed by China commercializing before we do.
Yeah, that's an obligatory question on nuclear energy.
Can
in
I
the
add
context
there,
of
because my question is similar. Can I just add there?
If I want to translate it in plain English, it's like saying, should we go the China way on nuclear energy?
No, definitely not. China went with coal, went with dirty energy.
So is the question on...
This is supposed to be cleaner, or
Yeah, yeah.
fourth generation nuclear reactors even use waste from older generation nuclear
Yeah,
reactors.
is nuclear energy cleaner? Is
No,
one thing.
that's what I also want to know, because fundamentally, as we are growing over the next 30 years, power is going to be our, buckway. It has always been. And as you move to smaller cities and small, power is hardly there. And what do you think should be the strategy, per se, as a country, in terms of power? What should we be looking at? Because solar energy is becoming
So
cheaper.
one
Yeah,
question
that
is-
question, I think if I've got your
One
questions
question
right.
so nuclear.
His thing is nuclear
Yes, I'm
energy
talking
clean enough to
Yeah,
go
yeah.
for this thing? And his question is, what do we do with energy security given our environmental concerns, taking a 30-year framework in mind?
Absolutely, because solar is getting cheaper, but it's nowhere near the bulk production that we need to look at. And that's one of the biggest polluters, if you look at energy.
Yeah, actually, that
And I hate
since Jairam has a very scholarly approach, let me ask that question in a focused way. Is this hype about alternative energy good enough in economic terms? That's
Okay.
also a...
Okay, so let's take these three questions. First question on nuclear. See, nuclear energy is the cleanest form of energy. Cleanest. People don't realize this. From a clean, green point of view, you can't do better than
Waste?
nuclear.
Yeah.
No, but I'm coming. But it's risky because there's a threat of nuclear accident like what happened in Fukushima in May 2011. You have the problem of radioactive waste. What do you do about disposal? Then you have, the problem of proliferation. It's risk. But from an environmental point of view, we cannot abandon. From an environmental point of view, a nuclear power plant is cleaner than a coal-based power plant. People don't realize this, but it is a fact. Now, what should we do on nuclear? That's the big question. And that's tied up with the solar question. They're linked with each other. You can't separate the two. Because today, if you have, say, 1,000 megawatts of solar facility, you need to set up 1,000 megawatts of fossil-based facility because that solar plant is running only 20% of the time.
To cycle it.
You need power 100% of the time. So for getting power 100% of the time or 80% of the time, you require only two options, either a coal-based plant or a nuclear power plant. Now, 5 years from now, maybe energy storage will see the revolution that mobile phones have seen. And everybody will be carrying a mobile phone in one pocket and an energy storage device in the other pocket. And you are tapping the sun's radiation and generating the energy. It's possible. But as of today, the more solar energy you put on the ground, the more nuclear and coal you need on the ground because of the fact that you have to generate power.
Intermittency.
So that's a cruel choice. We cannot be like Germany, which says no to nuclear energy. Germany has said by the year 2020, we will close down all our nuclear power plants. Unfortunately, we do not have the luxury of doing that. So, the depressing answer to your question is that nuclear is here to stay. And it won't be a big chunk of our energy basket. Today it's about 3.5%. By the year 2030 it will be about 5%. But that 5% will still be a very critical chunk. So I think nuclear is something that we have to learn to live with. And we have to take all the steps that we require in order to mitigate the risks associated and make sure that we don't have Fukushima type accidents. And that's what is happening, that's what is driving nuclear costs up. Today, if you set up a nuclear power plant, it's 10 rupees a unit. Whereas if you set up a solar power plant, you're setting it up at 4 rupees a unit. Solar costs are coming down, nuclear costs are going up. So, but as a country, you need both. Now the question on energy security.
Energy security tied to that?
No, I think there is no question that we need and we should have more solar. There is no reason why the country that has no sun for 6 months in a year has become the world leader in solar energy. Germany today is the world's leader in solar energy. Germany has no sun for 6 months a year. However, the amount of capacity that the Germans have invested in, every German house now, virtually every German house, has a solar rooftop. And in a nation of 80 million people, 6 million Germans are generating power and feeding it into the grid. They are generating power because they have solar panels, they meet their requirement and the extra is fed into the grid. Imagine, in a country of 80 million, 6 million people are energy producers. There are 80 million energy consumers, but there are also 6 million energy producers. So the structure of the producing industry has radically transformed itself in Germany. We have a long way to go.
But is it replicable in India to start with?
It has to be, because there is no country which has the solar radiation that we have. Large parts of India, I don't know how many of you have been to Ladakh. I mean, the highest solar radiation in the world is in Ladakh. Why can't Ladakh be all solar? There are large parts of central India, Andhra, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Telangana, this central Indian belt, which has the maximum solar radiation. There's no reason why we can't have solar. But the tragedy is that the more solar you have, the more base load capacity you need to put up, because of the need to generate power throughout the year, and because we do not have a technological revolution in energy storage. So we should build up our solar capacity. We are not an oil-rich country. We are not a gas-rich country. We are a coal-rich country, but the more coal you produce, the more carbon dioxide you will put up and more forests you will deforest. So in my view, the route for energy security is more nuclear and more solar.
May I ask a small smuggle in a political question? In the past 2 years, do you think the BJP government's approach towards industrial policy in any way relaxed some of the stuff that you talked about? Because very keen to know if they are going in for that aggressive growth. Do you see any signs on the ground that some of the concerns that you talked about are being waived? There's a new coal linkage policy, for instance.
See, if you're looking for a news bite.
No, I'm looking for deep insight. Goes with the knowledge factory.
You're looking for a bite to put out.
No. This is a very august
Let me
gathering of.
In the last 3 years, now it's 3 years.
3 years, okay.
Time flies. In the last 3 years, 2 things have happened. First, let me say about the negative thing. There has been a dismantling of environmental regulation. The importance that is given to environmental regulation, standards, rules, institutions has declined. And in the name of ease of doing business, because that is now the mantra is ease of doing business. The ease of doing business has led to an unease with environment. So that's the negative part. What's the positive part? Is a huge emphasis on solar energy. Huge emphasis. When I was in government in 2014, we announced a plan for 20,000 megawatts of solar capacity by the year 2022. Mr. Modi has announced a plan for 100,000 megawatts. He's increased the target 5 times. He may or may not achieve it, maybe 4 years, 5 years later. But the target has been increased 5 times, no doubt about it. So there is a lot of aggressive emphasis on solar. And the net result is, when, for example, I was the minister in environment, solar cost was almost 12 rupees a unit. Today, the solar cost is 3 rupees 50 paise a unit.
Partly aided by technologies.
Partly aided by technology, partly aided by this huge ordering, you know. So there is a negative aspect and there is a positive aspect. The negative aspect is not much concern with environment, blind emphasis on GDP growth. The positive aspect is that 5-fold increase in the capacity for solar by the year 2022,
That's amazing.
which is good.
Any other question? I think I saw some raise. Yeah, there are too many hands, but yeah, we do have the luxury. You've been.
Specifically speaking on solar, I wanted to get my office done and I was told that there is a subsidy given by the government on this. And when I called a company who was doing solar, he says, yes, the subsidy is there, but you have to take it yourself. I said, why are you not doing it? He says, because for us, it is only on paper. Last 3 years, we've not got the subsidy.
Oh, it's an enforcement issue. See, solar energy is supposed to be gaining subsidies, but it's apparently the companies that are doing it are unwilling to pass on and telling the customers, saying that if you want, please do it yourself, because the government is not giving us the promised subsidy. So in other words, there are ground level implementation issues on subsidies for solar energy. Is there, do you see any?
No, subsidy, the solar, the only subsidy that I see now is the viability gap funding, which the government has said that we will match the viability gap from a government grant. But I don't see in the last 3 years the capacity has gone up. The capacity, not the production. The capacity has gone up from something like 3,000 megawatts to almost 10,000 megawatts now. So there's been a huge increase in capacity. How much of it is translating into supply and production is a separate issue. The big issue on solar is not so much the subsidy in my experience. The big issue is land, because 1 megawatt of solar capacity requires almost 6 acres of land. So getting that land, large amounts of land, Rajasthan, possible, Gujarat, certainly possible, parts of Madhya Pradesh, certainly possible, but in other parts of India, getting large contiguous amounts of land.
I have a romantic idea. We can move IT parks to rural areas where the, bandwidth can help people communicate.
See, because unlike the German model is all rooftop. We are not going the rooftop way. We are going the utility way. So instead of a 1,000 megawatt coal-based power plant, we will set up a 1,000 megawatt solar plant. A 1,000 megawatt solar plant requires 6,000 acres of land. To get 6,000 acres of land in India, in one area, is somewhat difficult. So I think one of the solutions to this is to go more and more rooftop, more and more buildings going rooftop. If some of you
so you like the Delhi government's policy?
No, forget Delhi government. You see the Jorbagh metro station, just not very far from here. There is a Jorbagh metro station. Just walk along that road. It's called the BK Dutt Road. And you will see a huge building. You can't miss it. It's the building which is the headquarters of the Ministry of Environment and Forests. And you look at the top of that building, it's completely solar paneled. And it generates 1 megawatt of solar electricity. So it requires nothing from the grid.
Oh, wow.
Nothing from the grid. It generates all its power, not only for lighting, but also for air conditioning.
Did you do it during your tenure there?
Unfortunately, I couldn't sit in it. I was the person who got the land and designed it, but by the time the building came up, I had left. So somebody else is, benefiting from it. But it's a good example of how you can go the rooftop way. I mean, I don't see any reason why this building, for example, why all the hotels in Delhi cannot be rooftopped with solar, why all the government housing, CPWD housing cannot be rooftop solar. That requires no subsidies, that requires no land, and that can be done immediately.
Any question? Yeah? Yeah, I think that lady over there. Thank you.
I was so close, so I just, okay. We work in the CSR area, and we have seen a lot of NGOs and other corporate projects which are doing in, parts and where they're bringing in solar energy, maybe, taking it to the villages also. Where there's no power, they are bringing the solar. What I mean to say here or ask is, when there are so many small projects being done by different people and stakeholders, who is responsible to do it collectively? Why do it in pockets? Because you see, everybody does it. And they have got so much of money which goes into that. The operational expense of doing that small project is so high. Why can't this be done in a collective way where there is a vision, where any such project comes under a one big umbrella, and that way we can achieve much higher impact than what we have right now?
It's as they say, it's like a suggestion she's offering. She says that a lot of CSR money is being spent in trickles, whereas actually working together in a collective way is a more efficient way of spending the resources, is what I'm saying. Maybe there is a case to do collective CSR as opposed to individual company-wide CSR.
But even, when
As they
I
say,
agree that collective CSR can be a very huge thing to achieve, but then at least there can be some regulation which says, okay, if you're doing a project in this area, then even selection of an area where it is being done. Like there are 350 villages where a particular multilateral is doing a project. The similar kind of a project is being done in those 5 villages. Other villages are left
so we
alone.
need something like a Bombay plan for environmental CSR.
Well, if you're interested in this subject of CSR, I can send you some material. There is one district in Chhattisgarh, Raigad, where the collector 4 years ago came up with a very innovative approach to CSR, following exactly the point you're making. There were about 50 companies, big companies, Jindal, Tata, Monet Ispat, you name it, Mittal, all of them were there in Raigad because it's, the coal hub and power hub. So 50 companies jostling to get credit for CSR. So what the collector did was he called all the 50 together. He prepared a portfolio of investment required in the district. I require so many schools, I require so many hospitals, I require so many roads, I require so much of afforestation to be done, etc., etc., etc. He created a portfolio of district requirements. And then he asked the companies, which of these fit into your portfolio of CSR? And he tried to match, in a very innovative way, he tried to match what the district needed with what the companies could extend through CSR. It went up to a point. Problem with this is that every company wants to take credit for the CSR. They don't want the CSR to get subsumed in some vast ocean of a district fund. Virtually what he had done.
Yeah, they want to build a brand.
Yeah, what he had done was he created a district pool into which this money went, and the money was flowing from the pool. Whereas the companies wanted to deal directly and put up boards saying done by Jindal, done by Monet, and so on and so forth.
But it's a very good point.
So, but the suggestion that you made is very important because in one district you find so many guys wanting to do CSR and ultimately chasing the same thing that it makes a lot of sense to pool your resources together. But I think now by default all the resources are coming together. I think the RSS is making sure that all the resources come together.
Now, if I ask him anything, I'll be accused of asking a political question. One last question, this man here, sorry, Arya. Please be quick and specific. One.
Sir, just an idea here. A lot of strands are coming together. Say, looking 20 years ahead, 10 years ahead. You have, for the first time, the Economic Survey of India has talked about UBI, which is Universal Basic Income. Robotics and automation are depriving people of jobs in the future. We don't know where the jobs are going to come from, though economists assure us they will. In that sense, when you're looking at creating jobs from aggressive industrialization or whatever, aren't we perhaps following a different model? Should there perhaps be some thinking about UBI? And in that case, the whole ecological and green movement has to adapt to that situation in an environment where jobs are going to be perhaps fewer anyway.
I don't know.
Well, if you're going to have 100,000 megawatts of solar power, that's going to create thousands of green jobs. So there is a lot of employment potential in the type of green growth strategy that we are talking about. But manufacturing jobs, I mean, the big thing is whether in the jobs will come from the manufacturing sector. That, I think, the jury is still out, because the nature of manufacturing is completely shifting. But in green services and in the type of green manufacturing that we are seeing, particularly in renewables, we are seeing actually a large number of jobs. In fact, I read an estimate somewhere recently that 50,000 jobs have been created so far because of the solar expansion that we have had. And if this continues the way it is, then not only will there be green jobs in the manufacture and installation of solar systems, but more importantly in the servicing of the solar systems. So I think, we have been used to thinking of green manufacturing. We should start thinking now of green services. And I think you will find much more jobs in green services than perhaps in green manufacturing.
We are really short of time, so thank you so much, Jairam Ramesh.